Welcome to the Hockey Writers Fantasy Forecheck, where we talk to you about all things fantasy, Keeper League, Redraft, and Dynasty. We're going to give you hot players to pick up, prospects on the rise, sleepers you should or shouldn't think of acquiring, and prospects who are looking to break out at the NHL level. This week, we will be discussing strategy for drafting goalie prospects in Dynasty leagues. I'm your host, Caleb Kerney.
And I am Jacob Strozyk.
We're going to have a little bit of a different show today. Today, there's going to be no prospect talk at all. We're going to start with the fantasy hockey implications of the Ryan O'Reilly trade, and then we will talk about some hot players and cold players, and we're going to end our show with the topic of the week. So, on Friday night, the hockey world was hit with this big trade, Ryan O'Reilly to Toronto. It's kind of a big deal. But what does it really mean? And a couple observations, pardon me, that I have come up with just looking at Ryan O'Reilly's season so far. He's greatly underperformed on the power play. His goals 4/60 and expected goals 4/60 and Corsi 4/60 is all lower than league average for forwards. According to Evolving Hockey, he only has 2 power play points in 41 games. At the same point last year, he already had 7. And his, for the past 7 years, he's kind of been between 12 and 24, and he's also seeing 30 seconds less on the power play this year than he has in the past several years. Also, his assists are way down than they usually are. Last year, at this point, he had 19 assists. This year, he has 8. So there's some just kind of weird stuff kind of going on with O'Reilly right now. His secondary assist rate is much higher than average so far. But given that he only has 8 assists, the samples, you got to look at the sample size and just kind of see it as a bit of an anomaly. It should normalize, and things I believe will be different now that he is with Toronto. Jacob, what are your kind of first impressions of Ryan O'Reilly to Toronto?
Yeah, I remember I was kind of just sitting around and I saw the trade just kind of come through, and it was a bit shocking what team he ended up going to. I wasn't really expecting Toronto, but yeah, O'Reilly has really been, for lack of a better term, a straight up disappointment as far as fantasy comes, and honestly, as far as just regular production goes. He's not amazing as far as fantasy goes, but he's normally a pretty consistently good or average performer. He gets a decent amount of shots normally. He wins a lot of draws. That's normally where his best asset is. He's a good playmaker, so he normally has a good amount of assists. He can score goals. He does chip in on the power play here and there. But this season, for some reason, he just hasn't been able to make anything connect. Recently, he's been doing okay. He's got 4 points his last 4 games. But, at the start of the year, kind of up to this point, he hasn't really been contributing much. He's also regarded as one of the better two-way players just in the game, and he's sitting at I think it's minus 25 or 26 right now. So the fact that all of his normal categories that he would be giving you value in, he's not contributing in anything. It's been an all-around disappointment in St. Louis. So going to Toronto gives him a much more different fantasy outlook, because he goes from a team that's very clearly selling everything and trying to, kind of lose as much as they possibly can at this point, to a team that is really trying to make that big push. They're going to try and win games. He's going to play with good players. Everybody kind of thinks that he might slot in on that, third line role, but that doesn't mean he's necessarily going to be sitting at, 13, 14 minutes of ice time. He's still probably going to be getting upwards of 15 to maybe 17 minutes of ice time, depending on how he gets utilized. In his first game, he had over 16 minutes with the Leafs. So he's going to be used in a top 6 role, and he's going to get his chances to play with some good players, and he's going to get some finishers to kind of get him going. The Leafs don't intend on wasting a first-round pick for somebody they're just going to bury on their third line for some depth. If they really want to do that, they would have just gotten Acciari.
Yeah, and like that's one of the big things. I mean, obviously just one game, but in his first game, O'Reilly lined up with Tavares and Marner. Okay. Marner is killing it this year. Tavares is doing awesome as well. So you got two guys there. Marner's, I guess he's kind of more the finisher there of that trio. Tavares and O'Reilly definitely, could play off each other in terms of playmaking ability. We should see O'Reilly's assists go up, playing with those two players. And, in that first game, Jacob mentioned, just over 16 minutes of ice time. He did get an assist, and he got a shot, 2 hits, and in the face-off dot, he was 85.7%. Okay. And that's going to be the big thing, I think, going forward with O'Reilly in Toronto, is he's going to be that guy that they lean on to win key draws, when they're down a goal, when they're up a goal, or whatever. They need to protect a lead. They need to try and tie it up. He's going to be out there winning draws and making sure that they have possession so that their other big guns can score. And that's going to be a big thing for Toronto. As far as fantasy goes, like his value in category leagues, I think, is going to go up. Normally he is pretty good mostly for category leagues. For points leagues, kind of average, but in categories where you need the shots, you need the hits, you need the face-offs, you need all of that wide coverage, he's going to be a better option to look at because of this opportunity in Toronto. And, similar to what happens in Edmonton with Draisaitl and McDavid playing on the same line, with Tavares also being on that line, being a natural center, they can be more strategic in who they specifically put out to win, what draws on which side, all that kind of stuff. And it is definitely a better situation for O'Reilly. The only thing that's like a slight concern, but we'll just kind of see how things play out. They're playing again today, but in that first game, he was on the second power play unit with Yarncroc, Bunting, Engvall, and Sending. So not the most ideal situation, but the top power play already has Matthews, Marner, Tavares, Nylander, and Morgan Rielly. So it's going to be tough to see if he can actually crack that top power play. It may come down to an injury, or maybe the power play starts slumping, so they decide to mix things up and have 2 extremely lethal power plays and try and distribute the wealth a little bit.
I don't think there's too much of an issue with him not being on that first unit, because we're talking about the Toronto unit that revolves mostly around Marner, Matthews, Tavares. That they run that unit. Nobody's really going to get moved around or tossed off of that. And then you can't really discount what Nylander does anymore, because he's really, stepped up. So if O'Reilly gets time on that second unit, he's just going to boost the possession and how well they can kind of maintain that zone. And he is going to provide that playmaking aspect, because he is that type of a player. He's not super fast, so he's not going to be the one, flying up and down wings, making a bunch of ridiculous, speed moves. But he's the one that when he's in the zone, he's going to help them out as far as, moving everything around for the second unit. Him playing on the third line, giving him Bunting and giving him Yarncroc, I don't see too much of an issue with that, just as his general utilization goes, because Yarncroc can still score goals. Bunting, he scored a bunch last year. He's still scoring at a decent rate this year himself. So they're giving him 2 good enough weapons that he should be able to still produce some numbers. So I don't see it as too much of a scoring issue, giving him those 2 players to kind of utilize. But I still stand by the fact that even if that's going to be his general use, he's still going to have plenty of ice time mixed in just because he's not going to be underutilized because he has so much value in the faceoff circle, and he normally has so much value in his like transition and possession game going up and down the ice. He's a very good two-way forward. It doesn't really show in his stats this year, but in general, when you watch, it's just the way that he plays. He's very good at transitioning from one zone to the next, and that's going to stabilize and balance those two players in Yarncroke and Bunting. The more he plays with them, and if anything, it might rub off on them, and he might teach them something, and that's something that they'll have going forwards into future seasons. Because I don't think he's going to sign there long term. He strikes me as I'm still good enough that I can go off and get a expensive deal somewhere and get paid a good amount of money. I don't think he's going to take a $1 million contract in Toronto just to go and sit and play there for another year. Who knows? You never know. Players sometimes do that kind of stuff, but I don't see him as that type of a person. So beyond this year, if you're planning on thinking, oh, O'Reilly's going to stick with Toronto, he's going to have great success there for a long time, I don't really think that's the play. I think O'Reilly is more of a this year only, get as much value out of him as you can while he's producing on Toronto. But be wary on the fact that he hasn't been producing all year, so don't be surprised if he doesn't just get a massive, upward trajectory in his numbers. He might just get a steady, small incline just because he's playing with Toronto.
Yeah, and just a couple just sort of bookends to close this section of the show today. O'Reilly gives the team itself a lot of options at center, and if they want to shorten their bench in tight games and run three lines, or if they want to mix things up and run three lines, the defense is going to have their hands full with O'Reilly on a third line, and Yarncroc and Bunting, those guys, they drive to the net, they grind it out, they can grab the puck for O'Reilly. O'Reilly can do his thing in the offensive zone, and then they can just crash and bang at the net and just get some dirty, greasy goals, and which goals all count the same on the score sheet. So that's not it doesn't really matter how you score the goals, generally speaking. As far as O'Reilly's goal scoring this year, it's actually kind of there's nothing irregular about the goal scoring itself. He's kind of at the same point, at the same level of goals this year as he was last year at the same point. And it's more just for him, it's going to be more about just finding his fit, playing with players that can finish, which, Tavares and Marner, in the very least, if he's going to stay in the top six, he's going to be able to finish. But that's going to be all of our O'Reilly talk for now. Jacob, you got a couple hot players for us. Who's your first hot player this week?
Yeah, so I always like to talk about hot players. First one I want to go into is Tyler Toffoli from Calgary Flames. He has just been one of the more consistent players throughout the entire season, and it's been a breath of fresh air just in general. But he's been fairly hot recently. He's got a top six role. As usual, he's playing anywhere between 15 to 17 minutes a night. He's got 5 points in his last 4 games. And the best part about him right now, as far as fantasy value goes, he's scoring in bunches. He's not just getting a goal here and assist here like he was earlier in the year. Right now, he's getting a goal and assist, or 2 goals with an assist. He's getting those multi-point games, and those really, really have a lot of value, especially in points leagues, because anytime, for anybody who knows how points leagues work, when you score in bunches, not only does it just stack more points on top of it, but sometimes you get additional points for multi-point games, or if somebody scores like a hat trick, you get bonus points on top of that. So when players start scoring in bunches, they're fantastic pickups. Toffoli might not be available on your waiver wire to kind of grab or anything like that, but he's somebody that you might have the opportunity to trade for before your trade deadline happens. If you have a trade deadline, not everybody does. But if you have the opportunity to pick him up either for cheap or you can sell him at a good price, I would say now is the best time to do that while he still has that hot streak kind of riding and his trajectory is still kind of going again up. But you could sell him off of the fact that he's hot now and the fact that he's been scoring more regularly all season. So Toffoli is definitely one of the hotter players for this week. Then
Yeah,
as far as you go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to touch quickly on just Toffoli's peripherals. His last 3 games, he's got 9 shots and 3 hits. So he does get you the decent category coverage. And he's definitely a guy who he's not a big marquee name. So you'll probably be able to get him a bit cheaper than, your bigger guys, and maybe easier to acquire him than this next player that Jacob's going to talk about.
The next one might be a little bit tougher to grab, but it's Arizona Coyotes forward Clayton Keller. My word, this guy is on some sort of a tear, and he's on some sort of a mission to undermine everything about the tank mission that is happening in Arizona. He's got 11 points in his last 6 games. And just like Toffoli, he's scoring in bunches, but he's scoring in bigger bunches. He's getting those 2-3 point games just on a regular basis. And the only reason he might be available for pickup is he plays for Arizona. He doesn't play for a very good team. But at the end of the day, he's still almost a point a game. And he's still putting up great overall scoring numbers. He's not physical. He doesn't really get any hits, but he puts on shots. He scores just about from anywhere on the ice. So if you have the opportunity to maybe sell him as far as utilization goes, if you're going to sell on a player like Keller, use him to upgrade to a better forward on a better team maybe, or use him as a package deal. Players like this are not really generally available on your waiver wire again, because he has that quote unquote star power. He is arguably the best current player that the Coyotes have as far as forwards go. So if you're going to acquire him, it is going to cost you a little bit, but if you're going to sell him, my best suggestion is to try and upgrade from him to a similar player on a better team or a better player on a slightly better team, and maybe package him in for a little bit of a deal there.
Yeah, Keller, he's fantastic. He's probably their most consistent player in Arizona, getting at least points wise. His peripherals doesn't really hit all that much, but in his past 3 games played, he's got 10 shots, 2 goals, 2 assists. You see him often when I'm checking the NHL box scores, as goals happen, and I'm looking through who scored, who assisted. Keller 9 times out of 10 is chipping in somewhere. So the fantastic guy that you can acquire. Again, his acquisition cost might not be as low as Toffoli's, but it still might be low given that he plays for Arizona, and maybe people aren't paying as much attention to that specific Arizona Coyote. So, Jacob, why don't you move into our cold streaks this week?
Yeah, so flipping the script all the way to the opposite end of the spectrum. One of the colder players recently is Washington Capitals forward Nick Backstrom. Since he's come back from his injury, he just hasn't quite looked the same. Just in general, he's got 2 points at the start of February. He's a -5. He's only averaging 1 shot per game in that same time span. He's not really getting any coverage in general. And Backstrom has always been a bit of a tough sell or a tough pickup in fantasy leagues. I've had him myself a few times over the years, and I've avoided him in a few years because the way he functions is if he's not scoring points, he's not really giving you any value because he doesn't throw hits. He doesn't shoot that much. He's a pure playmaker through and through. So when he's not producing, he's not really giving you anything fantasy value wise. So when he's on this type of a cold streak, he's definitely more of a drop rather than sit type player. I wouldn't even say that he's a sit versus start player. He's more of a drop and pick somebody else up type player.
100%. Backstrom is drop worthy in pretty much every league. He's not even rostered in my 8-team Dynasty league. So there's no point. There really isn't. Jacob, who's the other guy that people may or may not want to acquire?
The other one might be a little bit tougher to swallow, but is Philadelphia Flyers forward Owen Tippett. He's had some good stretches throughout the year, so he's bound to go through a bit of a cold streak as he continues to adjust to being a more consistent scoring forward. He does only have 2 points in February so far. He's also a -5 in that same span of time. He is still shooting, so as far as getting shots off, you get a little bit of coverage there out of him, but the results aren't quite happening for him. He's not really getting. It's not that he's not getting the chances, it's that he's not finishing his chances like he normally would. He's a goal scorer through and through. And at the end of the day, similar to Backstrom, if he's not producing points, he's not really giving you too much fantasy value. He sometimes can throw some hits, but his primary value comes from shooting and putting up points. So he may be available on your waiver wire. He may not be. I've seen different stats where he's rostered at about maybe like a 40% rate, and others where he's rostered at about a 60% rate. So he might be available on your waiver wire to maybe pick up as a Hail Mary for maybe he'll heat back up type thing, but he's definitely a sit versus start candidate for me.
Yeah, I mean, definitely sit until he heats up. He does provide some hit coverage. And in the past couple games, he's only had a couple hits, 5 shots. So not terrible, but not amazing. He's still kind of finding his way, since he was, traded to Philadelphia. So, yeah, sit and wait to see if he can pick things up, or if there's somebody who's just on an absolute tear who's available, pick them up instead. So,
yeah.
Jacob, thank you for those cold streaks this week. And now, the topic of the week. I'm excited for this one. Strategy for drafting goalie prospects in dynasty leagues. A lot of people say goalies are voodoo. That is true in some respects. But there's also some information out there, if you look deep enough, where you can see some trends and see what kind of goalies, what leagues they play in, what performance level they're at. You can get a better sense of what kind of goalie you should target when you're drafting for your dynasty leagues. Now, as sort of a quick disclaimer before I get into a lot of the meat of my notes here for this section, I'm going to be referencing a blog that Byron Bader wrote for his hockey prospecting website. So you can go to that website, just search hockey prospecting. It should be the first one to come up. There is a blog section, and a lot of what I'm referencing today is in a blog post that he wrote. And he wrote it, when did he write it? He wrote it basically while he was prepping to make the goalie equivalency model on his site. And I am just quickly scrolling this to see if there is a date on here. And I am not seeing a date. So I believe it was before the 2020 draft, because he references a couple goalies that were kind of drafted around that time, but not after that time. So regardless, goalies. Now, the tricky thing about drafting goalies is goalies take a long time to develop. They typically take 3 to 7 years to become good rosterable goalies. You know, a lot of the times it is more to the end of that 3 to 7 year window, which makes drafting a goalie kind of risky in that sense. If you're a rebuilding team in your Dynasty League, maybe not so much. But obviously, you want to try and get the guys that are only going to take 3 years to develop instead of 7. Now, it's tough to predict that. But some of the research that Bader did in coming up with his model, you know, there was some things that he kind of noticed as far as goalies are concerned. Now, in all of his information and his projections, he classifies an NHL goalie as a goalie who plays at least 100 NHL games. Okay. So if they're in a backup role, or if they're playing like 20 to 30 games a year, you're looking at about 4 years. Playing 20 to 30 games for 4 years, you're considered an NHLer. Now, the success rate of where goalies are drafted in the actual entry draft, there's only a 50% success rate for goalies becoming NHLers when they're drafted in the first round. And that number is different for forwards and defenders. It's 75% for forwards and defenders. Now, the success rate in rounds 4 through 7 is actually a lot higher. He didn't cite a specific percentage. But when I just sort of took a look at some of the starters or the 1As and the 1Bs that are around today, and a couple who are no longer playing, I came up with some interesting guys here. Ville Husso was drafted in the 4th round. Melko was drafted in the 5th round. Saros was a 4th rounder. Sorokin was a 3rd rounder. Shesterkin was a 4th rounder. Hellebuck was a 5th rounder. Henrik Lundqvist was a 7th rounder. Linus Altmark was a 6th rounder. Frederick Anderson was a 7th rounder. Kemper was a 6th rounder. And Philip Grubauer was a 4th rounder. Those are some pretty great fantasy goaltenders that are drafted, in that 4 to 7 range, with the exception being Sorokin in that list in the 3rd. And some goalies that have been drafted in the 1st or 2nd round in recent years have been, Demko was a 2nd rounder, Ottinger was a 2nd rounder, Campbell was a 1st rounder, Jacob Markstrom was a 2nd rounder, Vasilevsky was a 1st rounder, Spencer Knight was a 1st rounder. And so one of the interesting things, and I'll let Jacob chime in here in a second, is the NHLer success percentage based on the first eligible draft year league that the goalie played in. And this is between 1990 to 2010 in the first 7 rounds of the draft. There's a 71% success rate for goalies that played in men's Euro leagues. That is an incredible number. Okay, so men's Euro leagues, we're talking KHL, VHL, SHL, Liga. Those are the big ones. Czech League. Those are the big ones. 38%. There's a 38% success rate for those drafted in junior Euro leagues. 24% success rate for goalies drafted in US leagues. 23% from the CHL. 21% from non-recognized Euro leagues, and 13% in lower level Canadian leagues. And if we just zoom in on the success rate, just looking at all Euro leagues, there's a 44% NHLer success rate if the goalie plays in a men's Euro league by their D+1 season. that's some pretty good odds to look at. So when you're looking at those goalies, when you're drafting for your dynasty team, and you see a Wallstad or you see an Askarov or those kind of players that are playing in a men's league in their D+1 season, you're almost at 50% to just pick one of those goalies. And that's pretty fantastic. Jacob, what do you have any thoughts on kind of some of the things that I've said so far?
Yeah, so I'll kind of tackle it from a bit of a just standard drafting perspective. There's a reason that you don't really see too many goaltenders getting picked in the first round anymore, because you don't really need to use such a high pick on a player that's going to take you 3, 4, 5 years to develop. You're already going to use that time span on a player that's going to be picked in the 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th round. So that's why you see a lot more goalies get picked towards the tail end of the draft. But as far as the difference between kind of North American goalies versus the European goalies, the difference in competition between the junior leagues here and the men's leagues over there is just vastly different. So that's why so much more success is seen out of those European goalies, out of the Swedes, out of the Russians, out of the Finns. A lot of times it's the Finns. And it's because those leagues are just so much more competitive, and they are playing against professionals, either washed out NHL professionals or professionals that continue to just rise within those ranks and decided not to come to the NHL. So there's still so much value to be had in those leagues. And when you're playing in that environment as a 17, 18, 19-year-old, you're gaining so much more experience on the speed of the game, on the physicality of the game, on how goals work in the game and how positioning works. The ice is a little bit different over in Europe. The rinks are slightly different dimensions, but the same principle still applies for just learning how the pacing works. So you see a lot more NHL readiness out of somebody like Wallstedt, Askarov, because they played in those higher end leagues before they transitioned to North America. The fact that they're in the AHL is only for the sake of, all right, we need to readjust them to how the North American ice works and how the angles work in our arenas, so that they can take their habits, or that they can take their instincts and turn them into good habits on this type of an ice. So from a drafting perspective, it makes more sense to use those later picks on goalies that are in the SHL or in the Liga or are in the KHL, because you can still transition them more quickly to the AHL and eventually to your NHL roster than you can for a CHL player or from a US development player or even from a college player. You do see some college goalies make the jump, whether they were drafted or not, but it's still not nearly as high as those European goalies. And it's for that reason of competition and pacing and how that works. So as far as fantasy value comes into play with that, if you see goaltenders and you're paying more attention to the prospects as they get drafted, and you see somebody get picked in the first round, pay attention to the league that they are currently playing in. Did that first rounder get picked because they had a great season in juniors? Did they get picked because they had an average season over in the SHL? Did they get picked in the late first round because maybe instead of needing a goaltender, somebody needed a forward, so they only dropped for the sake of teams needing something else prior? So you really have a lot of factors to look into when you see goalies get picked early on in the draft. So whether that's first or second round. First round is kind of dicey. But you do sometimes get those home runs like your Jake Ottingers, your Vasilevskis. But you can also get some home runs in the second round. Not so much this year, but John Gibson was great for a good handful of years. Demko is still a good goaltender, just playing on a bad team. There's a lot of great goaltenders that are in the NHL that got picked in those kind of higher end ones. But at the end of the day, you really want to pay attention to what league are they currently playing in when they're drafted, especially if you're watching a draft with fantasy implications.
100%. And like, just to, I think that's a lot of good information for people to look at, and paying attention at the league that they're playing in when they're drafted is very important, because that will give you a sense of how far away they are. If they're already playing in the SHL, the KHL, or a Czech league, they're going to be closer. They might not be as close as you want them to be, but they're still going to be closer. Wallstad, I think, depending on what happens with Marc-Andre Fleury, I could see Minnesota next year running a tandem of Wallstad and Gustafsson. And Gustafsson's really proved himself this year, and they're both Swedes, so there's a bit of a nice camaraderie and connection that they can have there. But that's one big thing that I would look at, and makes the Kosa pick before Wallstad all the more baffling to me personally. And especially given that Kosa's playing in the ECHL now. So he's going to be more on the 6 or 7 years away than the 3 or 4 years, just because the ECHL is also even lower than the AHL. So he's got to work himself up to the AHL and then into the NHL. It's not saying it can't be done, but just saying that it's more of a long-term investment, and the chances of a CHL goalie becoming a regular NHLer versus someone who plays in a men's Euro league is a lot less when we're looking at the numbers here. And just as let
me chime in on that real quick. Sure. Just about the Kosa thing. So the reason the Kosa pick happened before Wallstedt isn't necessarily a matter of skill differential or anything like that. It was the readiness value. Detroit understood that Wallstedt has that advanced potential to jump up to the NHL level quicker. And by that point, Detroit already had what they assumed was going to be their goaltending going forward. They had Nedeljkovic and they had Husso. They were ready to go forwards with that goaltending group because it's already young. So they can afford to use that high-end pick for something that they felt was going to eventually be a major need, and still get that high-end talent that's going to take a little bit more time to develop. So as far as the logic behind the Kosa pick, that's what would be used there. But that still goes into the fantasy implication. You can still look at that pick and go, all right, it's going to take Kosa 3, 4, 5, maybe 6 years to actually come into the NHL. But by that point, you're going to be seeing the tail end of the Nedeljkovic-Husso group. Nedeljkovic's kind of already out of there, but you're going to see the tail end of Husso's time in Detroit, and that's going to be where Kosa's going to have the chance to rise up. Whereas Wallstedt, Minnesota needs that goaltending to come up sooner rather than later. So they need that higher end, more NHL ready prospect. That's why they really felt that they got that steal when Wallstedt was kind of passed over for Kosa, basically. But that's the logic behind that as far as actual drafting goes.
Yeah, and that's a very good point. And a lot of things that go into drafting deals with a player's potential, where they could be in 5 to 10 years. And NHL GMs, when they kind of salivate when they see a 6'6" goalie who's athletic, so he's big, he can move around super quick in the net, all that kind of a thing. So there's definitely a lot more factors than just the raw numbers that we're just kind of trying to look at here. But before we sign off here, I just wanted to quickly just dive into some prospect goalies that you might want to take a look at in your leagues, and just going to give just whatever leagues that they were kind of playing in their D1 or D+2 year. So Wallstad, in his draft year, he was playing in the SHL. Lucas Dostal, in his draft +2 year, he was playing in the Liga. That's the professional Finland league. Askarov, in his D+1, he was playing in the KHL. Kochekov, he played in the MHL in his D+1, the VHL in his D+2, and the KHL in his D+3. MHL is basically junior league in Russia. VHL is basically AHL, and KHL, everybody knows KHL. Hugo Elnefeld, he played in the SHL in his D+1. Devin Levi, who we brought up on the show a couple weeks ago, played NCAA in his D+2, and Danil Tarasov, MHL in his D+1, VHL in his D+2, Liga in his D+3, and KHL in his D+4. Those are all goalies I would highly recommend pursuing in a trade if you're selling off some assets and you're looking at somebody who might be a bit closer than other goalies out there. But that's all the time we have for today. Next week, we will be going through our trade deadline preview. So make sure to tune in for that episode when it drops. You can follow the podcast on Twitter at THW Fantasy. I'm on Twitter at Caleb Scouting.
And I'm also on Twitter at Stroz67.
If you are watching on YouTube, be sure to like this video and subscribe to the Hockey Writers YouTube channel. If you are listening in podcast format, subscribe to the podcast and please leave us a review on whatever platform you listen to. You've been listening to the Hockey Writers Fantasy Forecheck. Keep your stick on the ice, get pucks in deep, and give it 110%, eh? I'll see you next week.